Okay, welcome to the semifinal round of Prodigy 2022. I, Santika, will act as the moderator in this debate, and my friend Siva will act as the timekeeper. We would also like to introduce our adjudicators, Ms. Joanne, Ms. Apple Grace, and Mr. Hazran. The motion for this round is this House believes that the LGBTQ plus community should celebrate fiction containing queer-baiting content. From the government side, we have SMA Kolase Canisius, while on the opposition side, we have SMA Regina Pacis. To open the government's case, please welcome first speaker of the government.
Okay, hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me a second. Okay. So my PY preference is through the chat. Okay, I'll be speaking in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so today with the motion, this House believes that the LGBTQ community should celebrate fiction containing queer-baiting content. Our side of the House would say that we full-on support this motion. And to clarify a few things up, we would like to clarify the definition of queer-baiting, in which queer-baiting is hinting LGBTQ, usually through entertainment or in the media, or in this context, through fiction, in which the LGBTQ plus community isn't explicitly mentioned or maybe explicitly shown, but it is done through certain actions that might hint the presence of LGBTQ plus. And now, with looking at the status quo right now, the long-standing marginalization of the LGBTQ plus community has caused multiple biases and misconceptions and prejudices all over the community. So what I'm saying is that most people today, unfortunately, has had a misconception of the LGBTQ community, maybe due to its certain traits that might have been misconceptualized by them. And their representation through modern fiction should be celebrated because it advocates LGBTQ plus community, the LGBTQ plus community. Why? Because the LGBTQ plus community, as I've said earlier, are sometimes misconceived by certain people, and therefore through modern fiction, in which fiction is something very popular these days, through this we can actually celebrate this community. Therefore, the LGBTQ plus community can feel accepted in that certain country. No, thank you. The problem we see right now is that there are lots of teens who are a part of the LGBTQ community who are insecure about themselves, or maybe people who are still people who are still confused or maybe doubting their own sexual orientation, therefore making themselves insecure because, again, the LGBTQ plus community is sometimes misconceptualized in the modern day. And now we should notice that the LGBTQ community is not a disease or something to be ashamed of. And again, in the status quo, a lot of people now a lot of countries, I would say, have accepted the LGBTQ plus community as actual people and they actually accept them in mostly open-minded countries. No, thank you. And especially in the States, I would say, where the LGBTQ plus community, or through queer baiting, it is very, where queer baiting often occurs through fiction. And now the problem we see, like what I've said earlier, the fact that a lot of teens, the fact that fiction is a very common thing, especially to teenagers. Therefore, by actually seeing these hinted parts of the LGBTQ community, they can actually feel like they belong to the community, like they are accepted. Therefore, not feeling like some sort of disease or something to be ashamed of. And another problem worth considering is that the LGBTQ community has been largely misrepresented misrepresented by queerbaiting shows. Again, queerbaiting is something that is hinted, so it's not explicitly shown. Therefore, it can again create more bias, which might be something you cannot be concerned of. Although this is where we must consider to actually make it better, in which we must be able to represent queerbaiting in a way that accepts the LGBTQ community, in which the LGBTQ community should not be depicted as some sort of disease or something to be ashamed of, as I've mentioned earlier. And now, again, why should we just have queerbaiting or maybe advocate queerbaiting instead? Because again, like, even though it has been accepted in most parts of the country, sometimes there are some conservatives who might find it hard to accept this certain sexuality, and therefore, because queerbaiting isn't explicitly shown, or doesn't explicitly represent the LGBTQ community, it is actually, we can say that it's a light form. Therefore, they would be able to accept it a little bit more. And of course, in this sort of case, the vulnerable actors are people within the LGBTQ community or people doubting their sexual orientation. And therefore, the end goal is that we would like to hope that these queerbaiting characters depicted through fiction can actually help the younger generation to understand their sexuality, or maybe feel comfortable if they feel like they are part of the LGBTQ community. And these queerbaiting characters will represent and embrace a large part of the LGBTQ community, because again, these fictional characters are works in which they are made so that they can actually feel, so that the people who are watching can actually feel relatable, or perhaps they have something to represent. Therefore, these characters can actually represent them in such way. And of course, like for example, characters through Disney, I would say, like, for example, maybe Mulan, who there are some characters who might be part of the LGBTQ community, though not explicitly shown or said, but through their actions, they can actually, these people who belong in the LGBTQ community, or who feel like they belong in it, can actually feel like they belong to something. And again, of course, there are extreme examples in which some people might have depression, in which through these medias, people can actually feel belonged if they feel like they belong in the LGBTQ community, though not feeling like they are being unaccepted. So that'll be the end of my speech. Thank you very much.
Okay, the first speaker of the government has spoken for 7 minutes and 29 seconds. Responding to the government's case, please welcome the first speaker of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right, I'm setting my timer, yeah. For POI, just do it through chat. My gender pronouns would be she or her. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The existing queerbaiting art only undermines the actual representation of LGBTQ plus community, where these types of content does not depict the actual reality, and it undermines the actual struggles that queer people have to go through that could have been better portrayed in medias and actual representation that explicitly says that, hey, these are actually queer couples and not just some friendly guys hinting at each other with little bits of intimacy and chemistry, right? What is our stance here? We oppose the celebration of queerbaiting art, as it does not accurately does not accurately represent the LGBTQ plus community and the queer community at the slightest bit. We want explicit representation of queer couples in media, where the media and the creators actually say that these are actually queer people that are actually being incorporated in the characters of these arts, right? 2 points of mechanism here that has been really under elaborated inside government. First, on what is the metric of queer baiting content, right? Within this looks like altered contents that are actually made in ways that it depicts characters that are actually queer when they're factually not, when they actually shows a little bit of intimacy where they're actually hinting, but they're actually not real couples and they're only like best friends, right? Note that these contents are the things they're actually made in canon media and not, these are different than like fan arts or anything, right? But then secondly, what does this celebrating actually looks like, right? This is not this is actually not elaborated by side government. Within this looks like actively glorifying and validating that this is the right representation that queer communities undergone, right? This is the correct validation of the queer community. This is what we think celebrating actually looks right under side government. Some are rebuttals before actually going to two of my arguments, right? Side government talk to you about how the LGBTQ plus community is being misconceived and they need more representation, right? Yes, we agree with them, but we don't think that their benefit, that their proposal actually shows this to the slightest bit, right? Because it's misconceived, this goes for more harm in the LGBTQ plus community, right? We don't get why acceptance is only achieved through this method because there's no mechanism coming from side government and no likelihood as to why these kinds of queer baiting is actually better and inherently different than the actual representation that medias could have shown, and it's actually better in actually achieving this kind of acceptance when it's not even explicit that these people are actually queer couples, right? I think what side government is misunderstanding is the fact that these things are only common fiction and whatnot, right? Within that queer baiting content, it's not actual queer content because by virtue of the word, it's only baiting you, it's only like munching you to think that there are actually couples when they're actually not. They might act intimate, but they're not queer and they're not explicitly stated as couples, right? But then secondly, why are insecurities and validation only best come from these types of queer baiting are only settling for less, right? Because you don't actually represent the actual queer couples. They're actually explicitly set in movies, right? Realize that in order to achieve this metric of acceptance and validation from society, you have to make sure that people and society understand that there are queer communities, that there are queer couples, and not merely guys who are friendly to each other. This is the only way where acceptance can be achieved, because understand, acceptance require these types of acceptance actually come from the whole generality of the society, right? Because most people, because the entirety who are actually attracted to these types of queer baiting content is only the queer community, right? And not the entire society, because society then only thinks that these types of hints, that this type of intimacy actually only shows guys being friendly to each other, girls being friendly to each other, and not actually queer couples, right? In light of that, two arguments. First, why is this principally unjust? Second, on why this harms the overall LGBTQ plus community, right? First, on why this actually unjust, right? Because we think these are only monetizing based off of an unjust representation towards the LGBTQ plus community, right? Within the inherent representation that queer baiting often gives, it's not representative and it's not accurate to the reality, exactly because it does not depict the queer community, right? What is the metric to say that this representation is actually unjust? Two things. First, when there is nothing that shows that it's actual intimacy and love in the media between the characters. But secondly, when it's explicitly stated that these characters are actually real couple, right? This is when the representation is actually justified. This is not an explicit statement to say that these characters are intimate under the queer baiting contents, right? Especially when these types of content are made in the canon media, which is streamed by a lot of people, and they get money off of these things, right? And it gives a wide range depiction of what being queer is supposed to be like. But I want to note that side government, they never tell you on what correct representation actually looks like, and why is that queer baiting representation is actually enough to achieve this kinds of acceptance and these kinds of validation from society as a whole, right? Moving on to my second argument on why this harms the LGBTQ plus community, right? The underlying problem here is that queer baiting content often gives less incentive for media to curate actual representation, like movies dedicated for queer couples, for example, like Love, Simon, that actually dives deep in what a queer community and queer couples are actually like. We think these types of actual representation that can better be depicted in movies and arts are better off than queer baiting, right? What's the likelihood to this? Two things. First, people often include queer baiting contents only for the sake of likes and views. This is when one, people often find that representation is enough when you include several characters that seem to have a chemistry where they actually don't, and they are only friends or close friends, right? But then secondly, within that as a whole, representing the entirety of queer community, like writing novels or movies about a queer couple as the main character in the media, is still a risk that medias are reluctant to take because of the homophobic audiences, or the risk that they might lose audiences and views and ratings, right? Where this is only done for the overall aesthetics of the movies, right? What's the importance of this here then? Several things. First, within this problem is important because actual representation actually strives for better storyline and plots where these characters are the main character. Within, when you settle for these types of queer baiting media, you'll lose that broad intimacy that queer couples can actually go through. This is because in queer baiting contents, these two characters are often seen as a couple when they're actually not. But then secondly, LGBTQ plus community is in need of queer content of these types of representation in more mainstream medias. Within this is important, right? But thirdly, celebrating it would only mean that we continue to validate it as a means of media that's true and accurate, and the queer community actually thinks that it's enough of a representation when it's actually not, right? We think that this is still not enough because the existence of these queer baiting content does not improve the degree of normalization towards the queer community, and it does not decrease the amount of stigmas and discrimination that people still have. But then fourth, people will not normalize the existence of queer community in the end with this queer baiting content because people would only think that two guys can become just friends even when they share these little sparks of intimacy, right? This means that there's going to be constant denial of people towards the LGBTQ plus community and towards the queer. You get less validation from people for your identity as a queer because people think that when you have that tendency to show the same characteristic as what these queer characters show, people will only think that you're that you're just straight, but then you're only friendly to other guys, and being queer is not an actual identity that you can actually self-proclaim to be, right? What's the result of our proposal then? Several things. We push better incentive for media to actually create movies and arts because LGBTQ plus community is actually demanding for these type of actual representation. But then secondly, we push better normalization of queer medias in these type of canon media. So proud to oppose.
Okay, the first speaker of the opposition has spoken for 7 minutes and 30 seconds, responding to the opposition's case. Please welcome the second speaker of the government.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. POI preference just chat and pronouns he him. I'll start my debate in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'll start with my rebuttals first. So the opposition side has argued that queer baiting is bad because it doesn't accurately represent the LGBTQ plus community, and they want a more explicit representation. But what they haven't considered is that most companies and most shows are still hesitant in representing the LGBTQ plus community. And queer baiting is, in the government side's opinion, is only a step of representing the LGBTQ plus community the right way. Even though queer baiting is just baiting and not implicitly told that they are in a implicit relation, they are in an explicit relationship, or in just a relationship and not just like best friends. But it is a step in the right light because queer baiting and the countless amounts of biases that we have argued that the LGBTQ plus community has faced is so large in amount that we can't just expect people to accept these kinds of things immediately. And we need a slow process so that people can gradually begin to start accepting themselves. Queer baiting community may not be the most perfect kind of representation, but it is indeed a step in the right way. The opposition side has argued that we haven't given any good examples. And because of that, right now I'm going to give you an example of a queer baiting character that has been celebrated within the LGBTQ plus community. This queer baiting character being a character from Mulan named Li Shang. Li Shang is a character that trained Mulan when Mulan was dressed as a male soldier. And in that time, that character has developed feelings for Mulan and ended up marrying Mulan, even though first he thought that Mulan was a male. This had the LGBTQ plus community has seen this character as a representation of a bi character within a Disney movie and has countlessly celebrated the creation of this character. This character has been used as an example of a step in the right light. And this character, and like now, at least in the remake of the Mulan movie, this character has been obviously misrepresented, and because of that, a lot of the queer community has been angry. And this is a good example of a queer baiting character gone right, because a lot of people is angry because of this character because the companies misrepresented this character. This proves that the queer community actually cares for queer baiting character, and this proves that this character can be a good representation because the queer community also accepts this character as a good representation of their community. Maybe not perfect, but it is indeed a good step in the right way. And because of that, I think it is important to remember that again, companies are extremely reluctant, as you guys said, that they care about ratings. Companies want ratings and want approval from obviously more money, and it is important to know that companies are driven by that incentive. And because of that, a lot of families, especially more close families, are hesitant to see shows that represent queer characters. And by having queer baiting characters, we can show these families a more brighter spectrum, more about how the LGBTQ community isn't actually that bad. And it is important to remember that they are also our friends, our fellow humans that have relationships. It is important to know that they are indeed good people. And what we think that the opposition side has misunderstood is that not all queer baiting characters are best friends. There are other queer baiting characters, like we said, Li Shang from Mulan is a good example of a queer baiting character that is not just best friends. It is important to see that they actually have a relationship, and even though it was not implicitly said that he was a bi character, but the queer community has took it upon themselves to find that he is indeed a good representation for that category of sexuality. And by having queer baiting characters, we can ultimately slowly tear down the biases of the community, of the larger community, about queer people, and especially for those with more close and more religiously tied families. It is important to remember that queer baiting is a good start for those kinds of more close communities, and for a good way for companies to express how queer people isn't actually that bad, and it is basically an open and a more safe alternative than just not giving queer characters. And by you guys said also by giving queer characters, not by giving queer characters more, like, not other than not queer baiting characters, just giving queer characters, it is a better way to represent them. Well, obviously it is indeed a better way to represent them, but most people won't see these kinds of representations, and it will just it'll end up being a waste, basically, because the LGBTQ community might see those kinds of shows, but more conservative families, that is the more discriminatory families, will not be able to see these shows because of their already high biases. And it is important for that queer baiting to exist, because queer baiting is an important way to just give them like basically under the rug information that queer characters aren't that bad. It is important for the younger generation ultimately to see this because queer characters are queer baiting characters can be a great way to see themselves in these kinds of light and queer characters, yeah, ultimate, especially for those in more close families. Thank you. That is all.
Okay, this second speaker of the government has spoken for 7 minutes and 30 seconds, responding to the government's case. Please welcome the second speaker of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Do the pronounce are he or him? POI preference just through the mic because I'm not going to see the chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm dividing my speech into two parts. Firstly, a question on which side gives better queer representation in media, and secondly, on an extension on how this affects the love life of the queer community. So first question then, right? On which side gives better queer representation in media? What did the Gov team brought you? They brought you three things to the table. Firstly, they told you that misconception of LGBTQ because they don't want people to see it as a disease. This is just PM's entire speech, right? There are three responses to this. Number one, this is insignificant, right? When you want to only hint love, then the benefit of the entire side becomes ambiguous because not everyone has the sensitivity of knowing these two people are actually in love, right? Sure, they can give the Lisha argument every day, but I'm not sure not everyone's like the hint, right? I'm sure there are people who actually just see them as a friend, just see him as a friend, and because of hinting, it's never an explicit statement of this character is actually bi or this character is actually gay, right? So this benefit becomes inconsistent at the end of the day. Second response, how does a mismatch problem solution, right? If you want to give queer community affirmation, then you need to give an explicit representation. This is how you give a concrete example that these characters are actually in love, right? Or it's how you explicitly state that these people are not just two friends holding hands and just being best friends all the time, right? You need to give that explicit representation to actually give a more consistent benefit, but also to give a more stronger representation in the media in order for you to raise that misconception inside the school. That response is how they're exacerbating the whole problem, right? When you don't want to give the actual representation, then the standard of love that other people will set upon them will be just that. They will see how queer couples are only good, are only valid if they only act as the people who are queer-baited couples in the media, how they only see each other as very, very, very close friends or roommates or anything but lovers, then those are the ones that's the standards that will be put onto them in government's role. Secondly, about you and how queer baiting is a step in the right direction by companies. Two responses. Number one is untrue, right? We don't think queer baiting is a step forward. We think it's a step backwards because let's just contextualize this at the school, right? There are already good actual queer representation. For example, sex education. There's Adam and Eric. There's Arcane. There's Vi and Caitlin. We think when you celebrate it, all of these media that are already strong and prevalent inside the school will be undermined by the general public, because these kinds of media are already popular. These kinds of media actually give an accurate representation of queer couples, and their side is going to submerge all these media because the LGBT community instantly just celebrates the rest of the queer baiting art, while brings down the rest, right? This is why under their side of the house, the queer baiting is never a step in the right direction by companies. It's never going to, give further representation in media. The second response, then let's just weigh which side gives a step better to queer representation, right? Is it queer baiting or slow explicit queer representation? Under their side, when queer baiting becomes a celebrated and validated norm, then companies are willing to settle for less, right? My first speaker gave this analysis, but there are various ways towards it. So I'm just going to re-explain it again, right? I think when companies will see how queer baiting is going to be, complemented by the LGBT community, then companies will have more incentive to actually just give two boys, holding hands and being close friends without actually giving them actual progress, that they are more than just friends, right? How they see people who are implicitly trans or non-binary, but they just don't give the actual explicit guts to say it, right? I think when this kinds of things happen, then this is statement progress of queer representation, right? Because then every company will bandwagon and see how this is actually the right thing to do, and no one's going to be like the bigger person and just give boom a big actual expert representation in media, right? That's why I think there's at the house the progress does not exist at all. Thirdly, about how people are too conservative and discriminated. That's why we need a slower approach. I only have one response to this. This is an effective proposal, right? Because the burden of ambiguity still stands. It is not everyone, especially like parents who are religious and conservative and doesn't know anything about queer media, can take the hint that two queer people are actually queer in media, right? Except when you explicitly say to them that they're actually queer. Then the question becomes, how do you ensure that these kinds of people get the hint, right? I think this is a burden that the third speaker needs to answer, right? So with comparative in this class, what did we manage to prove to you? We managed to prove to you two things. Firstly, we told you that it's with how we can give validation that being queer is okay through actual queer media that pushes for normalization. But secondly, how we also prove to you that we can give acceptance and a sense of security better, right? We think that those kinds of validation can only come from actual representation that explicitly states that, hey, these two are actual queer couples, right? We think that these things are better off as a validation, because when you're only hinting, it gives the notion that the creators are only doing this for the sake of minimal representation, but they're still scared of explicitly incorporating the queer community. One extension of how this affects the love life of the queer community. What's the problem, right? I think as for example, a young gay boy, a kiss between two men on the screen is how they see a kiss as a symbol of love between two men, right? Because I think it's a rule of thumb that the exclusive major source of media, the major source of how we learn actions of love, the definition of romance, for example, is through romantic media, right? It's how we're taught a kiss is a symbol of affection by Cinderella or Snow White, for example. The difference is how these representations in status quo are done by straight couples and gives a less effective exposure for queer couples. This leads to little knowledge of how queer young people should act when they fall in love. Why is this likely to happen? Two reasons. Firstly, they see it as guaranteed, or we think that especially young people, they are guaranteed to be affected by it, right? Because we characterize them to be young and most likely going to be influenced by the media that they consume. They will take queer baiting content rawly and see it as a valid thing to do. Second reason, how exactly when you celebrate it, it gives the young LGBTQ people affirmation that is the right thing to do, right? The young people will like it and see it as a standard they have to follow, because media always dictates what goes inside real life and what doesn't, because the 21st century is always drugged on the media. So what's important? It creates a false expectation of romance, right? They see the queer baiting art and think of how that's me as a young LGBT person should act if I fall in love. It's how I should act around people around me, right? This leads to no sense of familiarity about what a relationship between two queer people should look like, because they don't know what to do and they don't know if what they're doing feels right. So how is it? So the expectation for other people, then when they see two queer people, it's going, in their best case scenario, they will only start asking questions like, why are you two so close? Why are you two holding hands as a gay couple? This gives a sense of insecurity towards queer couple in real life that don't know any better. Comparatively, at least we still want to celebrate actual queer media. The message becomes clear that when you are a queer person, this is how you're supposed to act in a queer romantic relationship, right? This is how you should kiss, this is how you should hang out, this is how you should do dates, for example. I think that's where we give the better representation towards queer media and queer people, and give a better sense of familiarity on how a love life should look like. So proud to oppose.
The second speaker of the opposition has spoken for 7 minutes and 31 seconds, responding to the opposition. Case, please welcome the third speaker of the government.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. So my PA preference, you can type it through the chat. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first of all, based on what I have heard from the first and second speaker of the opposition side, I think there are some misunderstandings. And here, we as the government side, we are actually trying to make these younger generations or teens who are trying to identify themselves their sexuality and join the LGBTQ plus community. Notice that right now there are a lot of people in society that are still not as accepting the existence of the LGBT community. So, okay, moving on. The opposition side keep on saying about the best friend, but we actually have given them an actual relationship, and based on my previous speaker, they have given a concrete example, which is the Li Xiang thing. Okay, so panels, the opposition side also offered their solution, and this solution will add up to ways, as my previous speakers mentioned. Uh, the opposition side, in our perspective, is too naive on how companies will show these kinds of show. Companies will settle for less by giving queer baiting characters. Our second speaker has mentioned it is a step into the right direction. So queer baiting is actually uh not perfect, not all queer baiting are perfect, but it is slightly a step into the right uh, directions. So moving on to the clash. So, okay, so what if the LGBTQ plus community uh uh, uh do doesn't even celebrate the fiction containing of queer baiting contents? So we need to know that in this context, LGBTQ plus community accepted widely, in which means people are still not admitting the existence of the LGBTQ plus community as, I mean, LGBTQ plus as a community. So if the queer baiting content is not celebrated, how are the LGBTQ plus community will have confidence? Okay, notice that most of the things are about their sexuality, and people should respect that, not reject them. Point I want to highlight here is about this. These are still arguing about their sexuality. Okay, so yeah, the end goal we are trying to achieve is to all the LGBT community to have confidence about uh, each of their personality, and also the end goal is so that society and people will recognize and accept the existence of the plus community, because knowing that the problem identification in this case is uh, people are still these or younger generations are still arguing about uh, their sexuality, and they are still insecure about themselves and they're shy to speak up about their sexuality. Okay, so look, your side of scenario is like this: when the LGBT Q plus when you are trying to give uh, more rather than the queerbaiting thing, people will definitely uh, reject more and more about the content, and uh, people who are still arguing about their sexuality again and again will still consider, and they will hesitate to join to the LGBTQ plus community because it is not widely accepted. Because as I mentioned before, right now it is still not widely accepted, and uh, people are still insecure about and still asking about their sexuality. So people younger generations will definitely insecure and be ashamed to open and speak up about their personality. This will end up to these or young generations to be shy, and because of they have no other people to talk to, and this will end up to talk to people about their sexuality. Okay, so we should know that queer baiting is a good media because it will be more widely seen and accepted by more prejudiced families. queerbaiting is present through media, therefore making teens with an LGBT community feel belong. And this will make up their confidence and build up their confidence so that they can speak up to other people and they're proud, knowing that, as I mentioned before, people are still insecure and shy to talk about their sexuality and their personality. So, in the end, uh, the opposition fails to understand, and we think that uh, their solution is unaffect and just disadvantaging the both sides. That will be all for my speech. Thank you.
Okay, the third speaker of the government has spoken for 6 minutes and 20 seconds responding to the government's case. Please welcome the third speaker of the opposition.
Is my voice audible? Is it
Yes,
audible?
it is.
Okay. POI through chat. Gender pronounce he, him, starting in 3, 2, 1. Dividing my speech into two clashes. One, which side give better approach or representation towards the LGBTQ, but second clash on the principal idea on the commercializing LGBTQ. First clash then, which side give better approach on representation of LGBTQ? What did we get in response under this clash? They talked about how one, fiction is gonna reach a lot of people and the LGBTQ can feel accepted, right? First response towards this. First of all, saying that fiction can be popular these days and directly jumping to, oh, LGBTQ can feel accepted on Gov is very jumpy. I don't get the process of likelihood, right? Literally, you must explain people's reaction, why they will accept it, right? Moreover, our side that explicitly, moreover, you must explain why under our side of the house, when we explicitly show the relationship of queer community on art, why is it not going to be effective at all? We barely got responses towards this. I think they lost this debate just because of that, right? But second response, sure, we can see how side government will have queer baiting art in media and it's going to reach a lot of people, but realize in order for this to become a benefit, you can't just say that once you have this queer baiting in art, in media, and it's a benefit, right? You must answer one, why this is the correct representation and why it doesn't affect the love life of queer community that my two speakers brought in their argumentation, right? Because on Gov, it makes people think that this is the way how queer relationship is like, right? As to how you're literally purposely making these two characters looking like they're couples and you're trying to make people think that they're a couple, right? They're a couple inexplicitly, right? People are starting to shift and think that, yeah, this is how the queer couple should look like existing in status quo, right? Under our side of the third response, under our side of the house, sure, we're going to have just the real queer relationship couple explicitly shown and not having it like an ambiguous story using queer baiting that doesn't explicitly say that the two queer couples are dating, for example. But this is way better for one huge reason, right? We're not trying to incentivize art creators to use this method just because, oh, it's more safer to approach the conservative people or to reach huge people, right? Oh, it's for it's for feeding the consumers because it's much more relatable because it's fiction, right? You're giving a false framing or picturization that makes it so hard to normalize queer couple, especially to the conservative people and all society and even young generations, right? They will think that, oh, once a real couple show up in real life, people are going to have the mindset that, oh, maybe they're just good friends being brought before, right? By my first speaker, right? This is likely because we told you before how media is the one setting the standard, right? What society sees, especially being supported by LGBTQ in media, is of course going to be a standard that this is a queer relationship that looks like, that is how it's supposed to look like, right? Because they're purposely trying to show the hint of the relationship, right? This makes society hardly accept queer couples as to how in media with the LGBTQ community makes all art start to make queer baiting art, right? Especially when LGBTQ supports it and celebrates it, it's going to incentivize art creators to make these queer baiting art. It encourages the picturization, it increases the picturization that queer relationship looks like queer baiting relationship, right? You're just giving hints. You're not supposed to explicitly show how queer couple looks like, right? This is bad under Gov for two main ideas, right? One, because the standard and all the effort of LGBTQ movement and status quo are demolished and gone, because what LGBTQ movement want all this time is to normalize queer relationship, right? Since the standard, but it's going to be hard since the standard on government is going to be there, and it's a long-term harm, and it's very hard to be reversed, right? Why is it so? Because literally government conceded that it will reach a lot of people in media, right? How are you supposed to reverse this standard when it's already consumed by all the people? This is government's best case, right? They want to make sure that it's all over the world and all in media, but this is going to be irreversible, right? When we told you all this harm about how misconception and misrepresentation of the LGBTQ, they never engaged to why this will happen under their side of the house. So I think it's already true and valid, right? But second idea on this, on why is it bad, right? Just like how the PM brought to you judges, they don't want to think LGBTQ as a disease, but they're not trying to show LGBTQ as a real relationship. We question why then, if Gov don't want to show the real relationship, then if Gov don't show the real relationship explicit to people, how will their side of the house people accept the queer relationship, right? And will stop think that it's a disease, right? They cannot solve it anyways, right? They're just making it worse, right? They're literally making people think that, oh, queer couples isn't supposed to be shown and explicitly shown. So it's governments who worsen their concern and literally making their concern even worse under their side of the house, right? We win the first layer. But second layer, when they talk about how, oh, the feeling of belonging, two responses. First of all, let's just point out how it's very exclusive. This is the feeling of belonging doesn't have to be from the queer baiting art. Literally, there are things like social media groups and Twitter, for example, and like Instagram movements. These exist and it's very accessible, right? Just through your phones, and it's very easy, right? Second response, even if feeling of belonging is very needed, then literally you can have it under our side of the house, right? Because under our side of the house, we explicitly show the representation. Queer couple look like this, and it's like other explicit relationship in status quo. It's not something that is gray and unclear. It is a relationship that it's very clear, because as a queer, I don't think you vision your relationship being gray and not showing and just showing hints to people, right? You want to be free and explicitly show that you're happy with your relationship, right? This is what you call the feeling of belonging. Unlike their side of the house, they're just showing hints. You don't want your relationship just showing hints to people, right? You want to be free and want people to accept you, right? So judges, vote for Gov if you think that the feeling of belonging is, as a queer, showing like freely to people, showing hints to people in government, right? Don't for them, because that's not the feeling of belonging that you want, right? But third layer, when you talk about how not all queer baiting characters are just best friends, first of all, it's very defensive, right? Saying that not all queer baiting characters are best friend and giving examples of Mulan repetitively is just very best case. Second response, even if not all queer baiting community are just best friend, I really question, right? Is this relationship going to be the one being in the queer baiting art? Because I think the context we're talking about is the queer baiting art being shown. So even though the queer baiting characters aren't just best friend and are in a relationship in real life, then what is the likelihood everyone will see this? But I'm going to be generous. Let's say everyone will see this relationship. Then it's literally counter beneficial, right? Then it proves that, oh, you're actually in a real relationship, but in media, you're not showing it. You're supposed to just show hints. Realize how people will see that, oh, you're supposed to hide it when being seen by people. You're not supposed to explicitly show it, right? This gives a really bad representation, right? Their benefit actually harms their team, and they cannot defend it anymore. But on the second clash, a minor clash, commercializing LGBTQ panel, we really don't get any response to this. I'm going to analyze further. Realize how you're using the LGBTQ community for media and profit, and they're the one that's going to be harmed. You're making profit out of you're making a profit and you're harming a group of community. This isn't a justified commercialization, right? When you're harming a certain group of people, and the certain group of people isn't going to get benefit at all, right? We're so proud to oppose.
The third speaker of the opposition side has spoken for 7 minutes and 25 seconds. To close the opposition's case, please welcome the reply speaker of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll start my reply in 3, 2, There's a lack of likelihood under side government. They never told you as to how queer baiting is a better form of representation. They only told you that this is only a stepping stone for them, but they never told you the thought process on how will it be accepted in the society, how will society digest it, and how will society react to it and see it as a better form of validation, right? Because realize that these type of queer baiting content are not explicitly stating that these two characters are queer, meaning that only a subsection of people actually feel that these two are a couple. This relies too much on people's different sense of sensitivity, right? Which they have not responded, which has been deliberately stated by my second and third speaker, right? And then they talk about helping kids who are questioning themselves and how this can actually become the answer to them, right? Then how does this queer baiting media help when the act of intimacy is not concluded to be actual love and relationship, right? I don't see the thought process and likelihood on how this will actually help kids who are actually questioning, who can actually help people who are actually questioning their sexuality, right? Because sure enough, I see Lee Shan's attempt in hinting his intimacy, but I can't guarantee that other people will see the same way as people have different sense of these types of sensitivity to these hints anyways, right? In light of that, two clashes. First, on why the celebration is inherently unjustified, and second, who benefits the LGBTQ plus community better, right? First, on why the celebration is actually unjustified. We have brought to you two things, right? On first, that creators are only monetizing based off this false representation, but secondly, regardless, the content is unjust to be celebrated because objectively, this is not content that depict actual queer characters, but when LGBTQ plus community celebrates it, it validates to your followers, to your society, that this is what queer community are actually like, and this type of representation is actually enough, right? What have they brought to you? They actually only bring that queer couples are not accepted by the media. It's better to use this as a stepping stone because not everyone can accept it yet. Two responses. First, there is no mechanization as to how the society will digest this type of media because if this is a stepping stone for you to gain validation and acceptance from society, within you need to tell us then how the progress is going to be laid out, how when you have these contents can suddenly society accept you, right? But then secondly, people have different sense of these types of sensitivity to see whether or not these characters are actually queer, right? Meaning that societal understanding and acceptance is not going to be equalized to all parts of society, and most likely this hinting will only be received by queer community only, right? Society who are not part of the community or who are not in support of the community will not have the same sense of sensitivity and will not see these people as queer people, right? There's a minimal response to the fact that these types of media are monetized to the extent when you celebrate it, it's going to give a clear message to the industry that this is that these types of things are actual representation and they're going to keep making more of it, right? But then second question on who benefits the LGBTQ plus better. What have we brought to you, right? Two things. First, on the fact that the LGBTQ plus community demands for more queer representation means that there is a better incentive and urgency and push for the industry to actually curate a better and actual representation that is not queer baiting, right? But then secondly, it gives better acceptance and validation and exposure of these types of community, right? We fight for medias that actually represent that these queer communities, so society's difference of sensitive so we don't really have to rely on the difference of society's sense of sensitivity, right? We've told you that this representation that's actual is still possible even if it's not widely accepted, right? The idea of queer community being represented is new. Even if so, we think that actual representation can still be manifested for as long as there's an active voice of demand from the community and its followers, right? This does not exist under their side of the house. The reason why we see Adam and Eric in sex ed is because of the long-standing demand from the queer community and its followers, right? Because even if it's not going to be accepted by all people, society is getting more progressive, and this kind of habituation is actually good because it collectively normalizes the idea of queer couples, right? What's the comparative here then? Two things. First, we give to you better portrayal. We give to you explicit queer content that gives to you more clarity, and you don't have to rely on people's different sense of sensitivity. But second, we habituate the idea of queer community in society, right? Within the media is prominent nowadays that it could penetrate through people's echo chamber. Side government want to sway the young generation. We can do that better by showing explicitly what queer people look like and not rely on people's different sense of sensitivity so proud to oppose.
The reply speaker of the opposition has spoken for 4 minutes and 28 seconds. To close the government's case, please welcome the reply speaker of the government.
Oh, hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. Nancy and him, and if you have a preference, just chat. I'll start my arguments in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first of all, I like to recap the arguments given by me and the main arguments given by the opposition. The government side have argued that queerbaiting embraces people within the LGBTQ plus community, especially like the younger generations. However, the opposition points that queerbaiting is often misconceived and would enforce that queerbaiting is harmful towards the community instead of being positive. Why I think we have won this debate is because that queerbaiting will reach a lot more people, and as the opposition said, set the standard for media. That kind of setting the standard is a good start, because by having queerbaiting characters be more of a standard and more standard within media and fictional works, we will start to change the views of many different kinds of people, especially the younger generation that is highly able to be influenced by these kinds of fiction and media. By having these kinds of things, as we said, this is just a stepping stone. As we said, queerbaiting is not a perfect representation, but it will just start the way for people to be more acceptance towards the LGBTQ plus community. Because as we said that it will reach a lot more people. A lot more people would know about queer characters and how they act and how they're like represented through fiction. And thus, by having these kinds of people that are more, by having a lot of people that see these kinds of things, they will start to learn how queer people are like. And as we said, it will make people understand that queer people aren't actually as bad as they thought because of their countless biases and such. Therefore, it will eventually set the standard, as the opposition said, that queer baiting characters at least isn't as bad as they thought. Therefore, by queer baiting characters, a lot of people will think that in turn, queer characters aren't as bad as they initially thought. And by having that, it is a stepping stone for people to see that gay people or LGBTQ plus people isn't as bad as they initially thought. I would like to also argue how their arguments that they should just go out with pure LGBTQ plus characters is a bad and a naive way of doing things. It is because of we need to consider that a company is driven by profit, and they will not give representation at all in turn because they don't want to offend a lot of people. Instead of us, our solution that gives a lot of coverage, the opposition solution gives no coverage at all, potentially no coverage at all. And this is more urgent than you may think, even though that there may be some shows that represent LGBTQ plus, but if families that are more prejudiced see these kinds of shows, they will just choose not to see them. Therefore, the biases that have been swirling up will keep on existing, whilst our solution will slowly remove those kinds of biases and make people know that these kinds of people aren't actually as bad as we thought. Therefore, it is logical to conclude that our solution will give more coverage and embrace more LGBTQ plus community, especially to the people that discriminate against these kinds of people, and to understand that they are not as bad as we initially thought, as the prejudiced people initially thought. I would like to close the arguments. I am proud to present our arguments. Thank you.
Okay, the reply speaker of the government has spoken for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. So this marks the end of this round of Prodigy 2022 debate. Please kindly exit this breakout room and wait in the main room for further announcement. For both team and adjudicator, thank you. We wish you good luck on the rest of the competition.
Thank you, everyone.
You guys.